It's time for Talking Pints. I'm joined by Squadron Leader, RAF retired Graham Laurie, MVO. Welcome to Talking Pints. Now, you were at a school that became quite well known. Rutlish Grammar in South London. You're a South London boy. And, of course, John Major was a couple of years ahead of you.
He was.
And like you, well, you're both cricket lovers.
Absolutely, and that's something that I knew. I didn't actually know him at school. I knew of the name, but I didn't know him. But later on, when I flew him out to Rome for one of the Euro conferences, I sent a passenger chit down the back and put on the bottom the name of myself, and then Rutlish School cricket captain 1964. And a couple of days later, in Peterborough's column, there was a comment that he'd been flown by a fellow Rutlish pupil and was heard to say, well, at least one of us did well.
That shows a great sense of humour.
Exactly.
Now, Graham, there you were, you know, Royal Air Force officer, going up through the ranks, squadron leader, doing all the stuff that an RAF officer in those days did. And suddenly you're doing work for the Sultan of Brunei and things start to happen and things start to change in your life. Now, in those days, we had something called the Queen's Flight, which we don't have anymore. Explain how that worked.
Well, I was summoned, I was the examiner for the Andover aircraft that the Queen's Flight was flying. And I was summoned for interview to perhaps go on the flight, along with 6 others. And because I was the examiner, I always think it was rather better the devil they knew than the one they didn't.
Inside job.
Inside job, but I've no idea whether that was true. But I went for interview with the captain of the Queen's Flight in those days, which was Sir Archie Winskill, who was a ex-Hurricane Battle of Britain pilot from Biggin Hill. And I realised afterwards that, in fact, the main interview was the fact that I was sitting in the crew room with everybody else, and they were all looking at everybody who'd come through. I was the lucky one. I got the job, and by ducking and weaving, I stayed there until the Queen's Flight was disbanded.
So there you are. It's 1981, you've joined the Queen's Flight, and you're assigned to the very, very newly married...
Absolutely. I took over the day they came back from their honeymoon, because my predecessor, Squadron Leader Derek Lovett, actually was allowed to extend his service by 2 days in order to fly them on their honeymoon. It seems such... I couldn't really go and fly them out on their honeymoon as the first time I'd ever flown them. It was so nice for him to bow out like that. And that was Archie Winskill's doing.
But suddenly you're flying, you know, these 2 incredibly famous people, and she became this quite astonishing global icon. I mean, but you couldn't believe your luck, could you, really?
Well, it was incredible. And, you know, everybody was following them. And the press coverage, when we went to airfields, I got worried that the photographers were going to get injured because the Andover was a propeller aircraft. And I had a real problem. I thought it's going to cause an accident. So I collared the Sun photographer, Arthur Edwards. And Arthur, I had a word with him, and I said, look, you know, can you control them a bit? And he said, of course I can. And he said, where do you want them? Where's the limit? And I said, outside the wingtip. And he said, OK. And we were at an airfield near Lincoln, and people started shuffling forward once the Princess had got on board, because they wanted to get a picture through the window. And I saw Arthur just grab one of the professional photographers were fine. They had their little steps. They stood up on that, long lenses, away they go. But I saw him grab a local photographer by the back of his collar and literally lift him back and just point out. And then I got a smile from him and a thumbs up.
Arthur was the top dog.
Absolutely brilliant guy.
And, you know, you flew them, but you also flew the Queen Mother, and you flew the Duke of Edinburgh, and you flew the Queen many times. How much of a sort of rapport did you manage to build up?
Well, Her Majesty never came up front to say thank you. She always went down the bag, always said to the captain of the Queen's Flight, who was normally on board, please thank the crew. Most of the others came up front at the end and said thank you. So we got to know them a little. But of course, 90% of the time we're doing our work up
Yeah, of
front.
course.
They're doing their work down the back, and work they did when they were on board.
And the young princes?
Well, we had, when Prince William was born, I was lucky enough to fly his very first flight. And when he got to about 2.5, I think it was, we took his parents up to Glasgow, and then he was going on to Aberdeen with Nanny Barnes, his nanny. And he came down the steps and shook hands with the group captain at the foot of the steps. Absolutely lovely, much to the delight of about 60 photographers. It really was. It was lovely. But then later, when he was about 3.5, he came up front one day and we were chatting to him. And I said to him, would you like to put the undercarriage down? So he leant over and we showed him what to do and he put it down. Of course, then when he grew up a bit and Prince Harry grew up a bit, we couldn't have two of them on the flight deck. It was too dangerous. So we had to stop him doing that.
So some fun times
and
some enjoyable times, but also, I mean, some difficult times. Now, what happened in 1994 with Prince Charles, this sort of supposed crash landing? What happened and how culpable were you?
I took the rap for it, quite rightly, because I was captain of the aircraft. There was no doubt about it.
So what, Charles wants to take the controls?
He took the controls and did the approach, and he said to me at about 500 feet, are we okay? We were a little bit high, but the 146 stopped very well. So I said, yes, land. And we did. We knew we were on the ground because the nose was right under our seat. We're doing that. I took the control column and pushed it forward as I normally did, but I think I probably did it a bit quickly because we'd landed a little bit down the runway and it lifted the main wheels off the ground. So consequently, when they came back down, two of the two tyres burst. So yes, it was my fault. We only went off the runway by about 4 feet. I now know there's a peat bog at the end of the Islay runway. If it had been Aberdeen, we'd have probably just taxied off the grass and back to dispersal. But not my finest hour. But isn't hindsight a wonderful
Well,
thing?
yeah, and other incidents. I mean, weather and aborted landings and things like that.
They all worked, but I'm known for the one that didn't work. But of course,
their life can be very unfair.
The Prince of Wales rang on the Sunday morning. This happened on a Thursday, and on the Sunday morning, I got a phone call to say the Prince of Wales would like to speak to you at 8:30. He came on the phone. His first question was, "How are your wife and family taking all the press coverage?"
That was nice.
Absolutely lovely. And then he also said to the Board of Inquiry that he wanted me to continue to fly him. I knew he was actually giving up flying, not because of the Islay incident, but because of the work level he had to do while he was on board. He found time, he was coming up later to do the approach, did the takeoffs quite often, although towards the end he started to say, no, I won't do the takeoff, I'll just do the landing. And you know, I realised that the amount of work, because he had to see all government papers, and has done for 50 years.
He's got plenty to do now.
Yeah.
And of course, in 1997, the dramatic, shocking news of the death of Diana, and you flew off to Paris with some of her sisters.
That's right. Yes, I was due to fly the Prince and I think it was Prince William back to Lynham because he was going back to school that morning. So I knew that I'd have a crew in. My son came in and told me at about 2 o'clock there'd been the accident. And when I woke up at 6, I realised it had been fatal. And that day just flew by. I think the lovely thing, as far as I was concerned, was that it was a Sunday. So the hierarchy weren't at work. So it was left to my crew and a few people at Northolt. When we took off from Northolt at 10 o'clock in the morning, there were 47 people working. When we came back, there were over 400 press
there. I bet there were. No, I bet there were, and the sad job of bringing the body back.
Yeah, you know, it was the shock of the original incident. I think when I got back up to Aberdeen, the crew said, "What are you going to do? What are you going to say when he comes forward?" And I said, "I doubt if he will," but he did.
He did.
We spoke apparently for about 4 minutes. I couldn't even tell my own crew. I wouldn't tell you what we said, but
sure.
I couldn't tell my crew half an hour later. It was just, I think the end of the day, we just went, oh, and that was it. But no, I was amazed he came up. And,
no, I would be too. And it's now a month 4 or 5 weeks have gone by since the Queen died, and literally outside the studio, that's where they were queuing.
Yes,
all up the
that's right.
embankment
Yeah.
and over Lambeth Bridge. Reflections on that?
Well, I think that showed what high esteem Her Majesty was counted in this country. I mean, she was wonderful. I mean, and what I liked about that, yes, it was very, very sad, but she was working 2 days before.
Incredible.
And absolutely working to the end. And I think it was in Scotland, which she loved so much. So it was never going to be good, but you know, to finish like that, and it was over quickly again, which I think nobody would have wanted her to hang around.
No, I agree with that. I think we can now reflect a bit more on it. At the time, it still seemed a hell of a shock to all of us. You know?
Absolutely.
And back to Rutlish, and back to John Major, who has been all over the press this weekend. And my goodness gracious me, the Crown, it appears, have really, as they've come into the modern age, well, according to John Major, taken some astonishing liberties, including a story that Charles wanted to engineer with the Prime Minister the abdication of the Queen 30 years ago. How do you respond to these Crown stories?
Well, everything I've been involved in the press has never been 100% correct. So perhaps I rest my case.
yeah. But it does look as though this last series of The Crown is going to be an American attempt at traducing the royal family.
Yeah, I think you're right there. I really do.
All of which makes me reflect on why Harry's working with Netflix, but I won't ask you that.
I'll sit back on that one.
No, I think you're very, very wise. Well, Graham, thank you very much indeed for joining me.
My pleasure.
Lovely to see you.
Cheers.
Thank you. OK, it's time for Barrage the Farage. You send your questions in. I don't look at them first, and we do our very best. Here goes. Robert asks me, what excuse does Belarus have to get involved with the Russian invasion of Ukraine? Well, look, you know, Belarus and Russia are pretty much joined at the hips. Their leaders are incredibly close, so there's no particular surprise in terms of how closely they're working together. However, if this flow of Russian troops into Belarus is to be another attempt on the Ukrainian capital, then that would be extremely dangerous. And it's a strange thing, you know, a couple of weeks ago, everyone was saying the Russian army's finished. And history teaches us, actually, if they're united, the Russian army is very rarely finished. One viewer says, with more attacks on Ukraine today, when do you think we'll start to see this settle down? The one thing I would say that's incredible is that anyone that tries to say, let's have a conversation about peace, is shouted down as being a Putin supporter. Graham, you know, you were in the Royal Air Force, part of our defence. Why no peace negotiations? Do you understand?
Well, it does seem, I know our present Prime Minister, I think, went to Russia just before the war and tried to do something. But, you know, there seems to be a lack generally, I think, of people wanting to take it on.